The Dawn raised her hand in front of every crime family in the room and slipped the ring onto someone else's finger. Not a mistake, not a slip. He looked his wife dead in the eye when he did it, and he smiled. Serafina Vale stood at the center of the Romano Syndicate's Centennial Gala, beneath chandeliers that cost more than most men earned in a lifetime, surrounded by 200 witnesses who had pledged loyalty to her name. And she watched her husband crown his mistress queen. The laughter came next. Quiet at first, then louder. Serafina reached up, removed her own wedding band without a word, set it on the nearest table like it was a cocktail napkin, and walked out. Every single person in that ballroom thought they had just watched a woman be destroyed. None of them understood what they had actually just set in motion. If you were her, if that was you standing in that room, what would you do? Before we go further, if you love stories that hit hard and don't let go, subscribe to this channel and follow this story all the way to the end. Drop a like and leave a comment with the city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to the beginning. Part 1. The night of the Centennial Gala had been planned for 14 months. Serafina knew every detail because she had planned most of it herself. The florists, the security rotations, the seating arrangement that kept the Moretti faction on the east side of the hall away from the Calabrese representatives on the west, the menu that avoided shellfish because old Dominic Falcone had nearly died of an allergic reaction at the 1987 summit and nobody had forgotten. She knew which waitstaff had been vetted and which door the Bratva contingent preferred to use when they wanted to speak privately. She had spent 3 weeks on the centerpieces alone, not because she cared about flowers, but because in a room full of men who read everything as signal, a centerpiece that leaned too formal read as aggression, and a centerpiece that leaned too casual read as disrespect. Details were survival in this world. Details were the difference between an alliance that held and one that fractured at the worst possible moment. Cassian had told her twice in the weeks leading up to the event that she was overthinking it. "It's a party," he'd said, standing at the window of their penthouse with a glass of bourbon in his hand, watching the city below. The way he always watched it, like he owned it, which he mostly did. People come, people drink, the ring gets passed, everyone goes home happy. Serafina had looked at him and said nothing. That was its own kind of language between them by then. Silence where there used to be conversation. Distance where there used to be something that at least resembled warmth. She wasn't naive about what their marriage was or had ever been. She'd understood the architecture of it from the beginning, the way certain things in this life were built on function rather than feeling. But there had been years when the function included a kind of respect that looked almost like partnership. Years when Cassian consulted her before making decisions that would ripple out through the network of relationships she'd spent a decade carefully tending. Those years had ended somewhere around the time Vivienne Cross appeared. Serafina first saw her 18 months ago at a charity auction in the city. A woman in a red dress who laughed too loud and touched Cassian's arm once too often, and looked at Serafina with the particular brand of contempt that people reserve for obstacles they're already planning to remove. Serafina had watched her for exactly 4 minutes, then gone home and pulled every piece of information available on Vivienne Cross: background, finances, connections, history. What she found had not alarmed her the way Cassian probably assumed it would. It had done something else entirely, but that was a thread she kept close, in the dark, where it belonged. For now. The night of the gala, she dressed in midnight blue because the color carried authority without announcing itself. She wore her grandmother's earrings, small garnets set in antique gold, the kind of jewelry that didn't catch the light so much as hold it. She did not wear the necklace Cassian had given her for their anniversary because the necklace was too large, too eager, too much like a statement he was no longer entitled to make. She arrived with him in the car because appearances were still operational, even when everything underneath them had curdled. He didn't speak to her on the ride over. She watched the city through the tinted window and ran through the evening in her head the way she always did. Sequences, contingencies, the specific faces she needed to reach before the night's ceremony, and the things she needed to say to each of them. The gala itself was everything she'd built it to be. The hall blazed. 200 guests representing 37 families moved through the space with the particular careful ease of people who had learned to perform ease as a professional skill. There were handshakes that meant more than handshakes. Glances across rooms that carried full conversations. Men who hadn't occupied the same building in a decade standing within 15 feet of each other and managing to pretend the history between them wasn't pressing against the walls. Serafina worked the room. That was the only honest way to describe what she did, and she had never been embarrassed by the honesty of it. She spoke to Enzo Falcone first, Dominic's eldest son, recently elevated after his father's health had declined, still finding his footing in the weight of that elevation and prone to overcorrection when he felt uncertain. She complimented something specific about a decision he'd made 3 months ago regarding a shipping dispute, something he hadn't expected her to know about, and watched the way it settled his shoulders. Then Rourke, the Irish contingent's lead representative, who trusted almost nobody but had a long-standing and never quite explained fondness for Serafina that dated back to something her mother had done for his family years before Serafina had even entered this world directly. They talked for 6 minutes near the bar. I was funnier than anyone in this room gave him credit for, and she made sure he knew she thought so. Then the Calabrese brothers, then the 2 Greek families, then the quiet, silver-haired man everyone called Professor, who ran the financial architecture of half the syndicate's legitimate fronts and communicated almost entirely in dry observations that sounded like small talk until you realized they weren't. By the time the ceremony hour arrived, Serafina had touched base with 14 people who mattered. She took her position at Cassian's side. The room gathered. The energy shifted the way it always did at this moment. 200 people drawing slightly closer together, the noise dropping by degrees until the space became almost cathedral quiet. The passing of the dawn ring was the oldest continuous tradition in the Romano Syndicate's history. 100 years ago, it had been the actual mechanism of succession. Now it was mostly ceremony, mostly symbol. But symbols in this world were not decorative. They were structural. They held weight that kept things standing. An elderly man, one of the original commissioner's grandsons, a role passed down like the ceremony itself, carried the ring forward on a velvet cloth. Old gold. Heavy. The crest of the founding compact engraved on its face. Cassian took it, and then he turned. Not toward Serafina. He turned toward the edge of the gathering, toward the place where Vivienne Cross stood, in ivory and diamonds, her chin lifted, her expression wearing the careful blankness of someone trying very hard not to look like they already know what's coming. Cassian crossed the floor to her. The room went so still that Serafina could hear her own breathing. He took Vivienne's hand. He slid the ring onto her finger. He looked up at her and said something quiet, too quiet for the room to catch. And Vivienne's careful blankness finally cracked into something that was not quite a smile and not quite a triumph, but lived uncomfortably close to both. Then someone laughed. Serafina didn't look to see who. It didn't matter. The laugh was the kind that gives other people permission, and within 4 seconds there were more of them, quiet and scattered but present, stitching themselves into the moment. She stood completely still. She thought about the centerpieces she'd spent 3 weeks on. She thought about Dominic Falcone's shellfish allergy, and the 14 conversations she'd had in the last 2 hours, and the garnets in her grandmother's earrings, and the specific architectural silence of a room that had just watched something irreversible happen. Then she reached up, removed her wedding band, and set it on the nearest surface. She walked out. She did not look back. Not because she was too devastated to look, but because there was nothing behind her that required her attention anymore. The morning after the gala, the calls started. Not to her, she had half expected that. The concerned voices, the carefully worded expressions of solidarity from people who needed to be seen taking a side before the ground fully shifted. Those calls came, but they weren't the ones she was paying attention to. She was paying attention to the calls she made. The first was to a man named Augusto, who was 73 years old and grew tomatoes in the countryside outside the city and had not attended a syndicate function in 11 years. He picked up on the second ring, which told her he'd been expecting her. "I heard," he said, before she could say anything. "I know you did. You waited longer than I would have." "I waited exactly as long as I needed to," she said. "Are you well?" "I'm old," Augusto said. "Old is well enough. What do you need?" She told him. There was a long pause. Not the pause of someone deciding, she knew. Augusto had made this decision a long time ago. It was the pause of someone feeling the weight of a thing they'd been holding for decades, finally about to move. "It'll wake up a lot of sleeping dogs," he said. I know. Some of those dogs don't want to be woken. I know that too. Another pause. Then, I'll make the contacts on my end. Give me 4 days. 3, she said. He laughed. A short, dry sound, not unkind. You are your mother's daughter. She didn't respond to that because there was nothing to add to it. By the 3rd day after the gala, the cracks in the syndicate were already visible to anyone paying close enough attention. Cassian was not paying close enough attention. He was doing what men in his position tended to do when they'd made a catastrophic public move and needed to not admit it. He was doubling down on the appearance of control. Vivian sat at his right hand at the emergency meeting he convened, the dawn ring visible on her finger as if repetition of the symbol could stabilize the authority it was supposed to represent. He presented her as the new face of the family's public operations. He used words like transition and evolution and strength. 3 of the 7 people in that room were already in contact with Serafina. She knew because she'd been the one to contact them. She spent those first 3 days in her apartment, not the penthouse she'd shared with Cassian, which she'd left without taking much, but the smaller place she'd kept for years under a different name in a different part of the city. The place that nobody in the syndicate had ever been told about, because there were certain things a woman in her position needed that the men around her didn't need to know she needed. She made calls. She received letters, physical letters, handwritten, carried by couriers who'd been doing this for older members of the network long enough that the practice felt antique and reliable at the same time. She read everything. She cross-referenced. She thought. On the evening of the 3rd day, she sat with a sealed envelope that had been delivered that afternoon by a courier she recognized as one of Augusto's. A young woman who handed over the package without making eye contact, which was correct protocol, and left without waiting for a response, which was also correct. Inside the envelope were 3 pages of handwritten notes and a photocopy of a document so old the paper of the original had apparently started to disintegrate. The photocopy was slightly crooked, like it had been done in a hurry or by someone whose hands weren't entirely steady. She read it twice. Then she sat with it for a while. The document was a founding charter, not the one the syndicate displayed in its official history, the cleaned-up version that mentioned legitimate business interests and organizational principles. This was the original. Older. More explicit. It named the 4 families whose combined authority had created the commission itself, the body that had given every crime organization in the network its legitimacy for the better part of a century. One of those 4 families was her mother's family, her grandmother's family. Her family. The Dawn Ring had not created the Commission's authority. The Commission's authority had existed first, and the ring had been created as an acknowledgement, a symbol of who held the mandate to convene it, to validate it, to make its decisions binding rather than merely advisory. That mandate had never been formally transferred. It had merely been forgotten, the way things get forgotten when the people who remember them die, or go quiet, or choose to let the forgetting happen because the moment isn't right for remembering yet. Serafina folded the pages back into the envelope. Outside her window, the city moved in its usual rhythms: traffic, voices, the distant sound of something that might have been a horn or might have been something else. She watched it without seeing it. She'd understood since she was 17 years old that her name carried a weight her mother had never fully explained, and her father had died before she could ask him about. She'd understood since she was 22, when she married Cassian, that the alliance had been structured around something older than either of them, that his family's reach required a particular kind of legitimacy, and she represented that legitimacy in ways that weren't discussed because the people involved found it more comfortable not to discuss them. She had never asked for this, had spent years actively choosing not to invoke it, because invoking it meant things she wasn't ready for, things that would change the shape of everything. She was ready now. She picked up her phone and made the next call. On the 4th day, Cassian began to notice that things were wrong in ways he couldn't account for. A shipment that should have cleared customs held up without explanation. 2 captains who were supposed to report in didn't. An ally in the Eastern District stopped returning calls without offering an excuse. He put these things down to the aftermath of the gala. Friction, adjustment, people repositioning themselves as the new order settled in. He was wrong, but he didn't know that yet. Vivian told him it was jealousy. She said that with the confidence of someone who had spent years studying how men like Cassian thought, which was true, but who had spent considerably less time studying the actual mechanics of how the syndicate's loyalty structures worked, which was the part that mattered. "They'll fall in line," she said, at breakfast in the penthouse that had been Serafina's. She was wearing something expensive and sitting in a way that suggested she'd been practicing sitting in that chair in her head for a long time. "People always do when they see there's no other option." Cassian nodded, looking at his phone. He didn't say what he was thinking, which was that the people in his network hadn't historically responded well to the assumption that they had no other option. That was actually one of the things that made this world particularly dangerous. Everyone in it had options. The options were just usually too costly to exercise. The question was whether that was still true. He didn't ask it out loud. He put down his phone and drank his coffee and told himself that the friction would smooth out. By the end of the week, Serafina had made contact with 11 of the founding family's surviving representatives. 8 had responded, 6 had agreed. The other 2 hadn't said no. They'd asked for time, which in this context was its own kind of answer. She sat across from Augusto in his kitchen. The actual kitchen, not a meeting room, not a restaurant booth. The kitchen with the tomato plants visible through the window and the smell of something cooking that she couldn't identify, but that smelled like something her grandmother had made once. And they talked through the sequence. "When you move," Augusto said, "it has to be complete. Not an overture, not a suggestion. Complete." "I know." "Because if it isn't complete, he crushes it, and then he has an excuse to crush everything you've built, and we're back to nothing but worse." "I know, Augusto." He looked at her. The look of an old man who has been proved wrong by underestimating someone and is in the process of ensuring he doesn't do it again. "You know how many times I've sat across from someone in this kitchen and listened to them tell me they knew what they were doing? I imagine quite a few." "Most of them didn't." "No," she agreed. "They didn't." He poured her more coffee without asking. It was the real kind, the kind that tasted like it had been argued with. "What about the summit?" he asked. "The summit is where it finalizes," she said. "Not before." He was quiet for a moment, then, "Cassian." It wasn't a question. It was more like a name being set down carefully on a table to see what sound it made. "He'll try to stop it," Augusto said, "before the summit, when he figures out what's coming." "Yes." "And Vivian will push him harder than he'd push himself. She has more to lose." "Yes." "So there's a window," Augusto said, "between when he figures it out and when the summit convenes. What happens in that window is what you need to be ready for." Serafina wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. Through the window, one of the tomato plants had a single red fruit visible on it, small, almost aggressively red against the green. "I'm ready for it," she said. And for the first time in the conversation, Augusto looked at her without measuring anything. He just nodded. The window Augusto had described lasted exactly 9 days. Serafina knew it was closing on the morning of the 10th, when she woke up to 3 missed calls from a number she didn't recognize, and a text from Rourke that contained only 4 words. "They know you're moving." She sat on the edge of the bed in the small apartment and read those 4 words twice. Then she set the phone down on the mattress beside her and pressed both palms flat against her thighs and breathed. One slow breath, the kind you take not because you need the oxygen, but because you need the second it buys you to think without reacting. Then she picked the phone back up and called Rourke. He answered on the first ring. "I've been up since 4, he said, by way of greeting. "Who told them?" "Don't know yet. Could be the Falcone boy. He's been nervous since you approached him, and nervous men talk. Could be someone on Augusto's end. Could be someone watching the couriers." A pause. "Could be someone you haven't thought of yet." That last part landed with a particular weight, and she knew he'd meant it to. "How much do they know?" "Enough to be scared," Rourke said. "And scared is worse than angry in my experience. Angry men make noise, scared men do things quietly and fast." She stood up and walked to the window. Gray morning light. The street below was empty except for a delivery truck parked at an angle that was slightly wrong. Not wrong enough to mean something definitive, but wrong enough to notice. Has Cassian moved yet? Not officially, but 2 of his people were seen near Augusto's property yesterday afternoon. She felt something tighten in her chest. Not fear exactly. Something colder than fear, more functional. Is Augusto aware? I called him before I called you. And? He told me to tell you he's fine and that he's been dealing with people like Cassian since before Cassian's father was born. Another pause, shorter this time. He also told me to tell you the window is closing and you should not wait. She watched the delivery truck. The driver hadn't gotten out. The engine was still running. She could see the faint exhaust against the cold air. I'm not waiting, she said. Good. Rourke's voice shifted slightly. The particular shift of a man who had committed to something and was now past the point of revisiting it. What do you need from me? Hold your position. Don't move anything yet. When I need you, I'll call, and when I call, I'll need you fast. Fast I can do, he said. Quiet I can also do. Both at the same time is where it gets expensive. I know, it'll be worth it. She hung up before he could respond because there was nothing more useful to say. She got dressed, drank half a cup of coffee standing at the kitchen counter because sitting down felt wrong, and thought about the delivery truck. When she looked again 10 minutes later, it was gone. Well, Cassian convened an emergency meeting at 9 that morning in the back room of a restaurant that had been a syndicate asset for 20 years. Vivian was present, which was itself a statement. She had installed herself at every meeting since the gala with the determination of someone who understood that visibility was its own form of authority, and that authority not actively exercised tended to evaporate. The room held 7 people, Cassian at the head of the table, Vivian to his right, and 5 captains arranged in the specific order that communicated their rank and current standing within the hierarchy. Marco, the eldest, sat closest to Cassian on the left, a position he'd held for 11 years and wore the way men wear things they've stopped noticing. Then Dario, then the 2 Petrov associates who handled the Eastern logistics, then a young captain named Birch, who had risen faster than almost anyone in the organization's recent history, and whose speed of ascent made certain people nervous for reasons that weren't entirely about jealousy. Cassian set a photograph in the center of the table. It was a photograph of Serafina, taken 2 days ago apparently, entering Augusto's property. She was wearing a coat the color of charcoal and not looking at the camera, which meant she hadn't known the camera was there, which meant Cassian had surveillance on Augusto that Augusto didn't know about, or didn't know about yet. Somebody want to tell me, Cassian said, his voice entirely level in the way that certain men's voices went entirely level when they were at their most dangerous. What my wife is doing at Augusto Ferry's house? Nobody said anything immediately. Marco reached out and looked at the photograph without picking it up, then pushed it back to the center. Former wife, he said, which was technically a correction, but functionally an attempt to adjust the temperature in the room. Cassian looked at him. Marco did not elaborate. Vivian leaned forward. She had her hands flat on the table and she was wearing the dawn ring openly, which in this context read as either a power move or a miscalculation, and the room couldn't quite tell which. The question isn't what she's doing there, Vivian said. The question is what Augusto is agreeing to. The old man has been retired for 11 years. He doesn't take meetings unless the meeting matters. She approached him, Dario said. He had not been asked for his opinion, but Dario rarely waited to be asked. We know that. Question is what she offered him. Or what she showed him, Birch said quietly. Everyone looked at him. He was the youngest person in the room, and he spoke less than anyone else, which made the moments when he did speak land differently. He picked up his coffee cup and set it down. There are documents, he said. Old ones. I've heard things. Nothing confirmed, nothing I can put in front of you and say here, this is the thing. But there's been talk for years, among people who track the founding families, about certain records that were supposed to have been destroyed when the old commission restructured in the 90s, records that weren't. Cassian had gone very still. What kind of records? Founding documents, Birch said. The original charter, the one that named the bloodlines. The word bloodlines sat in the room like a stone dropped into still water, sending out rings that touched every edge. Vivian's expression had not changed, but her hands, the hands flat on the table, had pressed slightly harder against the surface, which was the kind of detail that people who were paying attention noticed, and people who weren't didn't. That's a rumor, she said. That's been a rumor for 30 years. Most rumors in this world are rumors because the people involved in the actual truth preferred it that way, Birch said. He looked at Cassian when he said it, not at Vivian, which was also a kind of statement. Cassian stood up. He walked to the window, a habit of his, this movement toward windows when he was thinking, as if the view of something external helped organize what was happening internally. The restaurant's backroom window faced an alley. He looked at the alley. If those documents exist, he said, and if she has them, what does that mean for the summit? Nobody answered right away. Then Marco said carefully, "It depends on what they say." "I know what they say," Cassian said, still looking at the alley. Something in his voice had changed. Not softer exactly, but less controlled. A man letting something out rather than keeping it in. "My father told me, before he died. Not everything. He wasn't capable of everything by the end, his mind was already going. But enough." He turned around. "The Commissione wasn't built on force," he said. "The founding families built it on consent. And the consent required a ratifying bloodline. A family whose name made the whole structure legitimate." He stopped. "I married into that family." The room was completely silent. Vivian was staring at him with an expression that was working very hard to remain composed and not entirely succeeding. "I'm saying the ring was never mine to give," Cassian said, and his voice cracked slightly on the last word. Just slightly, just enough to make Marco look away and make Birch look down at his hands. "And I gave it away anyway because I was a stupid, arrogant man who convinced himself that 30 years of building something meant he'd earned the right to rewrite what it was built on." The silence stretched another few seconds. Then Vivian said, "This changes nothing." Cassian looked at her. "The summit is in 11 days, she said. "If we move fast enough, if we consolidate what we have and demonstrate that the operational structure is stable, authority isn't about bloodlines. Authority is about what you control. We control enough." "We control enough right now," Dario said, "and we're already losing pieces." "Then we stop losing pieces." Vivian's voice had hardened. "We find out who she's been talking to, and we remove the option. Whatever she's building, we dismantle it before it stands." Marco turned his coffee cup in his hands once, twice, a gesture of a man considering something he hadn't decided whether to say. Then he set the cup down and looked at Cassian directly. "And if what she's building is already standing?" Nobody answered that question. Cassian sat back down. He looked at the photograph of Serafina walking into Augusto's property, her face turned slightly away, her posture carrying that quality she'd always had. Not rigid, not braced, but absolutely, completely settled in herself. He'd watched that quality for 18 years and called it stubbornness when he was generous and coldness when he wasn't. He was only beginning to understand what it actually was. "Find her," he said finally. "I want to talk to her." "Talking is past," Vivian said. "I didn't ask what you thought was past," Cassian said. He didn't look at her when he said it. "Marco, find her." Marco nodded once and stood up. Serafina was not difficult to find, which was itself deliberate. She was at a hotel, not the private apartment, but a hotel, a good one, a place with enough foot traffic and cameras and legitimate security that any move against her there would be a spectacle. She'd booked the room under her actual name, which communicated something precise. She wasn't hiding. She was waiting. Marco came alone, which she'd anticipated and which she took as a sign that Cassian was, at some level, still thinking rather than only reacting. Men who sent the muscle first. Men who sent Marco were men who wanted a conversation. She met him in the hotel bar at 2 in the afternoon. He was 61 years old and looked it in the way that people who've lived difficult lives look their age. Not broken by it, but weighted by it, every year legible on his face. He sat across from her and ordered an espresso he wouldn't touch, and looked at her the way he'd always looked at her, which was with the specific wariness of a man who had always suspected he wasn't seeing the full picture. "You look well," he said. "Don't," she said. He almost smiled. "He wants to talk." "I know." "Will you?" She looked at him steadily. "Tell me something first. When he sent you, was it his idea or hers?" Marco's expression didn't change, which was an answer. "She told him talking was past," Serafina said. "He overrode her. That's interesting." "He's not a bad man," Marco said, quietly, like he was saying something he'd thought about for a long time. "No," Serafina agreed. "He's a proud man who made a catastrophic decision under the influence of a woman who spent 2 years studying exactly which levers to pull. That's not the same as bad, but it has the same consequences." Marco turned his untouched espresso cup in its saucer. Once, twice, The same gesture she'd seen him make at the table that morning, which meant she had better eyes in that room than he knew. "What she said," he started, "about removing the option. I know what she said." He looked up. The wariness on his face had shifted into something more complicated. Not quite fear, but a man standing at the edge of something and looking down. "Then you know you're not safe." "I'm aware." "Serafina." His voice had changed. The professional flatness dropped, just slightly, just enough to show something underneath it. "I've known you for 18 years. I watched you hold this family together through 3 crises that nobody else in that room was capable of managing. Whatever this is, whatever you're doing, I need to know if you're walking out the other side of it." She looked at him for a moment, then, "Are you asking because Cassian sent you to ask?" "I'm asking because I'm asking." She let the moment sit for a few seconds. "You'll know the answer by the summit," she said. "Until then, tell him I'm willing to talk. Neutral ground. 2 days from now. He comes without her." Marco nodded slowly. "He won't like the condition." "I know." She picked up her glass. "He'll agree to it anyway." Marco stood, left the espresso untouched, and walked out of the bar without looking back. Serafina watched him go, then looked down at the table and allowed herself 30 seconds of something that wasn't quite exhaustion, but lived in the same neighborhood. The particular weight of a person who has been performing complete steadiness for long enough that the performance itself becomes its own kind of drain. 30 seconds. Then she straightened, picked up her phone, and made the next call. The next call was not to Augusto. It was to a woman named Petra, who lived in a suburb 40 minutes outside the city, in a house with a well-kept garden and 2 large dogs, and who had spent 15 years as the syndicate's chief financial architect before retiring with considerably less fanfare than the male equivalents of her role tended to receive. Petra picked up and said, "I was wondering when you'd get to me." "I should have gotten to you sooner," Serafina said. "I'm sorry." "Don't be sorry, be fast. What do you need?" "The account structures," Serafina said, "the ones that run through the Falcone fronts and loop back into the central fund. I need to know if they can be frozen independently of the operating accounts." A brief silence. "Why would you need to freeze the Falcone loop?" "Because Enzo Falcone is about to panic, and I need to remove his ability to do something irreversible with the fund before the panic reaches its peak." "You think he's going to break?" "I think he's 29 years old, and his father's been dying for 3 years, and he's been running a family enterprise he was never fully prepared for, and Vivian Cross has been in contact with him twice in the last week." Serafina paused. "So yes, I think he's going to break." Another silence, longer this time. "If I do this," Petra said, "and if Enzo figures out the freeze came from your direction, he breaks toward Cassian immediately. You lose him as a neutral." "He was never going to stay neutral," Serafina said. "The freeze is to protect the money, not to protect the relationship. The relationship is already spent." The sound of Petra thinking. Short, compressed sound, like a calculation being completed. "I can do it. Not quickly and not cleanly, but I can do it. 3 days? 2. You keep doing that." "Because I only have the time I have." Petra made that sound again. Then, 2 days. "And Serafina, the captain you mentioned, the young one. Birch." Serafina went still. "What about him?" "He called me," Petra said. "Yesterday morning. He asked me questions about the founding documents. Not about the freeze, not about the accounts, just about the documents. Specifically about whether they named a succession process." The line was quiet for a moment. "He's not Cassian's," Serafina said, more to herself than to Petra. "No," Petra agreed. "I don't think he is." "Did he say who he was calling for?" "He said he was calling for himself." A pause. "I believed him." Serafina turned this over. Birch, the fastest rising captain in the organization's recent history, the one whose speed made people nervous, the one who'd been the only person in that room to name the documents unprompted, not Cassian's, asking the right questions. "I'll handle Birch," she said. "I assumed," Petra said. 2 days on the freeze. Don't be late." She hung up. The meeting with Cassian happened on a Wednesday, in a private room above a cigar lounge in the old part of the city that had served as neutral ground for syndicate negotiations since before either of them was born. Serafina arrived first because arriving first was its own kind of message. I'm not afraid of being here before you. I'm not scrambling to match your time. She heard him on the stairs before she saw him. Heavier step than she remembered, or maybe she was only now paying attention to it differently. He came in alone, as agreed. He looked like a man who hadn't been sleeping well. Not falling apart, nothing so dramatic, but the particular stripped-down quality of someone running on less than they needed and compensating with effort. He was wearing the suit well, and the face less so. He sat across from her without preamble. For a moment they just looked at each other, and Serafina was aware of 18 years concentrated into the space between two chairs. Not warm, not cold, something more complicated and harder to name. You could have told me, he said, about your family, about what it meant. Would you have listened? His jaw tightened. Probably not, he said, and the honesty of it landed differently than she'd expected. No, she said, you wouldn't have. And I wasn't ready to force the conversation, so we both made choices that led here. That's generous. It's accurate. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. What do you want, Serafina? Past the summit, past the ring, past all of it. What do you actually want? She considered the question seriously, which he had probably not expected. I want it to stop being run the way it's been run, she said. The constant bleeding. The wars over territory that's barely worth the cost of the war. The families eating each other when there's enough structure to keep everyone stable if anyone was willing to hold the line. She paused. I want to hold the line. And me? That's not my decision to make, she said. It's the Commission's. Something moved across his face, not quite grief, not quite relief. Something in between, the expression of a man who has been carrying a thing and can feel it about to be taken from him and isn't sure whether to hold tighter or let go. She won't accept it, he said, Vivian. When the summit goes the way you're planning for it to go, she won't accept it quietly. I know. She has people you don't know about, he said, outside the syndicate, foreign connections. I didn't know the full scope until recently. He stopped. I should have known sooner. Serafina watched him. Tell me. He told her. It took 20 minutes. She asked 3 questions during that time, each precise, each pulling a thread loose that unraveled more than he'd initially intended to give. By the end of it, she had a shape in her head that was considerably more alarming than what she'd been operating with. Vivian Cross had not arrived in their world by accident. She had been cultivated, not by Cassian, who'd been too blinded by his own appetites to consider the possibility, but by an external organization that had been watching the Romano Syndicate for years and waiting for the right vector of entry. The Dawn Ring had been the target, not as a symbol, as a mechanism, as the thing that, if worn by the right person and recognized by enough of the families, would give an outside cartel standing access to the Commission's structure. She used you, Serafina said. Cassian looked at his hands. Yes, and in 11 days, at the summit, she intended to use the ring to broker recognition from the assembled families. Serafina's voice was flat and factual because the facts themselves were dramatic enough. With the Commission's recognition, her cartel partners would have legitimate standing in every operation, every front, every account structure that runs through the syndicate network. Every family in that room, Cassian said quietly, would have been exposed. Every family in that room, Serafina said, is currently planning to attend believing it's a routine summit. The weight of that sat between them. You have to warn them, Cassian said. I'm already moving, Serafina said. He nodded slowly. Then, I'll stand back. At the summit. Whatever you need, I'll stand back. He looked up at her. That's all I have left to offer, and I know it. She looked at him for a long moment. This man she had spent 18 years beside. This man who had publicly humiliated her in front of 200 witnesses and inadvertently handed a foreign cartel the keys to everything they'd built. Not a monster, not a villain. Something both more and less useful to be angry at than either of those things. Keep Vivian believing the summit will go her way, Serafina said. Don't change your behavior toward her. Don't warn her and don't provoke her. Can you do that? Yes. Then do that, she said, and stay out of my way until it's done. She stood. He didn't try to stop her. She was at the door when he said, behind her, Serafina. She paused but didn't turn. I'm sorry, he said. Not for the summit. Not because of what it's going to cost me. Just, I'm sorry. She stood in the doorway for 1 second. Then she walked out, down the stairs, and back into the street, where the afternoon light was the color of something just past its peak, still bright, but already tilting towards something cooler. She pulled out her phone and called the number she'd been saving for last. It rang twice. A man answered, low voice, unhurried, the kind of voice that belonged to someone who had spent decades in situations where urgency was the thing that got you killed. It's worse than we thought, she said. The cartel has a plan for the summit. I need the retired enforcers active by end of week. A pause on the other end, then, all of them? All of them, she said. Another pause. Then, quietly, it starts now then. It started 9 days ago, Serafina said. We're just catching up to where it already is. She hung up, put the phone in her pocket, and kept walking. Because somewhere across the city, Vivian Cross had just received word that the assassination team she'd commissioned 3 days ago had made contact with their target's location, and the window that Augusto had described was not closing anymore. It had just slammed shut. The assassination team came at 3 in the morning, 4 men. Professional. Not the kind of professional that meant expensive suits and clean records, but the kind that meant they moved without sound and knew which angles minimized their exposure to the building's camera coverage, and had done this enough times that the doing of it no longer required thought. They took the service entrance on the east side of the hotel, disabled the stairwell camera on the 6th floor with a device that produced a 12-minute loop of empty corridor, and moved toward room 614 in a formation that was compact and quiet and entirely without hesitation. The door to room 614 was open. Not forced open. Not broken. Open, standing ajar by about 4 inches, with the light inside off and the curtains drawn, and the specific quality of silence that a room has when it is genuinely empty rather than occupied by someone holding their breath. The lead man stopped, put up a fist. The team stopped behind him. He pushed the door open with 2 fingers and swept the room with a small light. Bed made. Luggage gone. A coffee cup on the nightstand with a lipstick mark on the rim and half an inch of cold coffee still in it. The kind of detail that said someone had been here recently and had not been in a hurry when they left, which was somehow more unsettling than finding the room trashed or barricaded. On the pillow, there was an envelope. The lead man crossed to it, picked it up. His name was written on the front, not a professional alias, not a code name. His actual name, the one that appeared on no document connected to this job and that only 7 people in the world knew he answered to. Inside was a single index card. On it, in neat handwriting, I know who sent you. Go home. He stood there for 4 seconds, holding the card, and then something happened to him that almost never happened anymore. His hands went slightly unsteady. Not trembling. Just the faint, involuntary response of a nervous system that had been doing high-risk work long enough to have learned that the truly dangerous moments were not the ones that felt dangerous, but the ones that felt wrong. This felt wrong. He pocketed the card, signaled withdrawal, and had his team out of the building and 2 blocks away in under 6 minutes. He did not call Vivian to report the failure until he was 20 miles outside the city, and when he did, he kept his voice level and professional, because whatever was happening in that hotel room was above his pay grade, and he had been doing this long enough to know when something was above his pay grade. Vivian listened to his report without interrupting. Then she said, very quietly, "She knew you were coming." "Yes." "She knew your name." A pause. "Yes." The line was silent for 5 seconds. Then Vivian said, "Come back," and hung up. Serafina was 40 minutes outside the city when her phone buzzed with a message from the man she'd spoken to last. The low-voiced, unhurried one, whose name was Constantine and who had served her mother's family for 31 years before her mother died, and had transferred that service to Serafina without being asked, without negotiation, without requiring any explanation for why he would do such a thing. The message read, "Team withdrew. No engagement. Your card worked." She was in the back seat of a car driven by a woman named Doris, who was 64 years old and had been Constantine's logistics coordinator for the better part of 2 decades, and who drove with the calm, efficient competence of someone who had long ago stopped finding any of this surprising. Serafina read the message, typed back a single word, "Good," and put the phone in her coat pocket. "Hotel's burned," Doris said from the front seat. Not a question. "Yes. Where to now?" Serafina looked out the window at the dark road and the darker fields on either side of it. Augusto's, but not the main house, the property on the eastern edge, the one with the storage buildings. Doris nodded and adjusted their direction without comment. The property on the eastern edge of Augusto's land was technically a farm supply facility. 3 large storage buildings and a small office structure that had been built 30 years ago and had served as the kind of location that doesn't appear on any syndicate's official records, but shows up in the memories of people who'd been around long enough. It was the place where, according to Constantine, 11 retired enforcers were currently waiting. 11 men and women, none of them under 60. All of them with the particular quality that long retirement gives to people who had been very good at dangerous things. A quality of stillness that was not peace, but something more concentrated than peace. The stillness of capacity held in reserve. When she walked into the largest storage building at 4:30 in the morning, they were all awake. Some were sitting, some standing. None of them looked like they'd been sleeping and been woken. They looked like they'd been waiting and had been doing so without complaint. She stood in front of them and said, "The timeline moved. We're not waiting for the summit." Nobody moved. Nobody asked why. "Vivian Cross knows I'm operational," Serafina said. "She sent a team to the hotel tonight. They failed, but she knows they failed, which means she knows I anticipated her, which means she's going to push Cassian to move before the summit rather than wait for it." She paused. "That changes what we need." An older man in the back, thick-necked, white-haired, with the particular face of someone who had taken a number of impacts over the years and had healed imperfectly, said, "What do you need?" "3 things," she said. "I need Vivian's external contacts isolated from the communication network before she can use them. I need the founding documents secured and in the hands of at least 4 of the assembled patriarchs before the summit begins. And I need whatever Cassian is about to do, to slow down." "Slowing Cassian down means getting to him," a woman near the center said. Her name was Greta, and she'd been the syndicate's most effective intelligence coordinator for 14 years before retiring to grow orchids. "He's not going to be reachable right now." "Not to us," Serafina agreed, "but there's someone he'll still take a call from." She pulled out her phone and dialed. It rang 4 times before a rough, sleep-thickened voice answered. "Do you know what time it is?" "Marco," she said. "I need 24 hours, that's all. Can you give me 24 hours?" A long silence. She could hear him breathing, the sound of someone fully awake despite the hour, processing. "He's already talking about moving on Augusto," Marco said. "Tonight's business scared him." "I know. He thinks you have more reach than he realized, and it's making him act before he thinks." "I know that too." "Serafina," Marco's voice had dropped even lower. "She's in his ear constantly. The last 6 hours, I've watched her work him the way you work a knot. Slow, patient, never obviously pulling. He's not the same man he was at the restaurant this morning." Something moved through her chest at that. Not sympathy exactly, but something adjacent. She pushed it aside. 24 hours, Marco. Tell him you need time to verify the intelligence before he moves. Tell him the enforcers' identities are still unclear, and acting on bad information will expose his flank. He might listen to that. He will listen to that because it's true. And because you're the only person left in that room, he still trusts his own judgment enough to second-guess for. She paused. "I know what I'm asking." Another silence. Then quietly, 24 hours. "After that, I can't hold it." "After that, you won't need to," she said. She hung up, turned back to the 11 people waiting in the storage building. "We have 1 day," she said. "Tell me what you need." They told her. She listened to all of it, asked 4 questions, made 2 adjustments, and by 5:30 in the morning, they had a working structure that was not a plan, so much as a series of contingencies stacked against each other. The kind of architecture that experienced people build when they know the terrain is too unstable for a plan. She did not sleep. At 8 o'clock that morning, Birch called her. She'd been expecting the call since Petra's warning, but the timing of it surprised her. She'd expected him to wait, to gather more information first, to approach with the careful indirection of a young man in a dangerous position who understood that moving wrong was more costly than moving slow. Instead, he called directly, introduced himself without preamble, as if she hadn't already known he would call, and said, "I want to talk to you. Not through intermediaries, not through whatever channel you've been using with Marco or with Falcone, directly." You're calling me directly right now, she said. I mean in person. She considered him for a moment. You were in that room yesterday morning? Yes. You heard everything Cassian said? Yes. And then you called Petra about the founding documents. A brief pause. How do you know about that? Because Petra told me, she said. She tells me things. Another pause, and she could almost hear him recalibrating. The specific mental adjustment of a person who'd been operating on an incomplete model of the landscape and had just been shown how incomplete it was. Then you already know what I'm looking for, he said. I know what you asked. I don't know why. I think you do. She said nothing for a moment. Outside the storage building's small window, the sky had gone from black to the flat gray-white of very early morning, and somewhere close by one of the dogs on Augusto's property was barking at something she couldn't see. Where are you? She said. 10 minutes from where you are. She went still. How do you know where I am? I've been tracking the courier network since the first sealed letter went out, he said. Not for Cassian, for myself. I wanted to understand what was moving. A pause. I'm not a threat, Mrs. Vale. I want you to know that before I get there. I'm not going to show up and be a problem. People who are problems rarely announce that they're about to be one, she said. Fair, he said. Do you want me to stay away? She thought about it. Genuinely thought about it. Not the automatic calculation of threat assessment, but the slower, stranger question of what a 26-year-old captain who taught himself to track a courier network for reasons unrelated to his employer represented in the context of everything currently moving. Come, she said. Come alone. He came alone. It was younger than she'd expected from the voice, or rather, younger than she'd expected from the quality of the mind she'd been building a picture of in the last 12 hours. 26, but carrying it like someone who'd been listening hard since he was young, the kind of person who absorbs rather than performs. He shook her hand when he came in, which in this context was almost startlingly normal, and accepted coffee from Doris without making a thing of the fact that Doris looked at him like she was measuring distances. He sat across from Serafina at the small table in the office and looked at her directly, which she noted. My mother was Elena Birch, he said. She didn't know the name. She let that show because pretending otherwise would be a waste of both their time. She worked for the commission for 6 years before I was born, he said. Not a captain's role, not anything visible. She handled the secure archive, the documents, the records, the communications that never entered the official history. He stopped. His hands were wrapped around the coffee cup and he was looking at the table for a moment before looking back up. She died when I was 11. Before she died, she gave me a sealed envelope and told me not to open it until I was old enough to understand it. When did you open it? 2 years ago, he said, when I was accepted into the organization. A very faint, very brief expression crossed his face. Not quite bitterness, not quite irony, something in between. The envelope contained a letter and a photograph. The letter described the founding documents, what they said, what they meant, where the original copies were stored. The photograph was of your mother. The room went quiet enough that the dog outside was audible again. Your mother's family, Birch said, and the archive. My mother understood that if anything happened to the woman who held the bloodline mandate, the documents needed a custodian who wasn't inside the organization, someone who couldn't be pressured or removed. He paused. My mother volunteered to be that custodian. She told no one. She kept it for the rest of her life. Serafina set down her coffee. She kept her face neutral with the particular effort of someone managing a response they don't want visible. The photograph, she said. What was it from? The back was dated 32 years ago, he said. Your mother was holding a document. My mother was standing beside her. He reached into his jacket and produced an envelope, old and worn at the edges, and slid it across the table. Serafina did not reach for it immediately. There's something else in the envelope, Birch said. Something my mother didn't explain in the letter. I've been trying to understand it since I found it. His voice remained even, but his hands tightened slightly on the coffee cup. There's a second photograph. Different date. The same 2 women. But there's a third person in it. A man. Standing slightly apart, like he wasn't supposed to be in the frame, but was caught by the edge of the shot. She looked at him. I recognized him, Birch said. It took me 6 months, but I found an old press record that matched the face. He stopped. It was Augusto Ferri. The name landed in the room and just sat there. Serafina picked up the envelope. She opened it carefully. The way you open things you've been told contained something important. Not dramatically, not hurriedly, but with the specific deliberateness of someone who understands that the act of opening is itself a kind of point of no return. The first photograph was as Birch had described. Her mother, younger than Serafina ever remembered seeing her, holding a document, the angle of her chin carrying an authority that Serafina recognized because she'd been told her whole life that she'd inherited it. A woman beside her that Serafina didn't know. The second photograph. Her mother, the same woman, and at the far right edge of the frame, caught mid-turn, profile only, recognizable only if you knew the face well. Augusto. Not as a bystander. His posture was wrong for a bystander. His posture was the posture of a man who was part of the conversation and had simply turned away at the moment the photograph was taken. Serafina set the photographs down on the table. Her hands were completely steady. Her chest was doing something she didn't have good language for. "He told you the window was closing," Birch said quietly. "He told you to move. He was the first person you called." He paused. "I'm not saying he betrayed you. I'm saying I don't know what he is, and I don't think you do either, and I think that matters." She looked at the photograph for another 3 seconds. Then she picked up her phone and called Augusto. It rang 6 times. No answer. She called the property line. 4 rings. A young man she didn't recognize picked up and said Augusto wasn't available. "Tell him Serafina called," she said. "Tell him it's urgent." She hung up and looked at Constantine, who had been standing near the wall during the entire conversation with Birch, as still as furniture, as present as a fire. His face told her nothing, which was unusual. Constantine's face always told her something. "When did you last speak to him?" she asked Constantine. "Yesterday evening," he said. "And?" "He asked about the summit location," Constantine said. "The physical layout, exits, entrances, sightlines." A pause. "I thought he was being careful." "What else could it be?" Birch said, not rhetorically. Constantine looked at him with the unhurried assessment of a man who has been in a profession where reading people incorrectly has permanent consequences. It could be someone who wanted to know the same information a person would want if they were planning to ensure the summit ended a specific way. The silence that followed was the kind that fills a room completely. Serafina stood up. She walked to the window and looked out at the property. The gray fields, the storage buildings, the pale sky. She felt something happening in her chest that was not fear and was not anger and was not the clean, cold focus that had been carrying her through the last 10 days. It was something rawer and less useful, the feeling of a person who has built a structure on what they believed was solid ground and has just felt the first tremor from below. She had trusted Augusto without reservation. She had told him the sequence. She had told him the summit. She had told him about the documents and the assembled patriarchs and the enforcers and the timing and the gaps in her coverage, the places where she was thin. She had told him everything. She turned back to the room. Birch was watching her with the expression of someone who has delivered bad news and is waiting to see what it does to the person who received it. Constantine had not moved. "How many people outside this room know the full sequence?" she said. "You and me," Constantine said. "Augusto. Rourke knows pieces. Petra knows the financial element. Marco knows only what was needed to slow Cassian." "So if Vivian's people knew to send the team to the hotel," Serafina said, "and the hotel was not shared with anyone in this room, the hotel was shared with Augusto," Constantine said. She nodded once, slowly. "He's been playing both sides," Birch said. "Not accusatory, factual, the way you state a thing that has become undeniable." "Or," Serafina said, "he's been playing a third side we haven't seen yet." She picked up her phone and called Rourke. He answered on the second ring. "I was about to call you," he said. "Tell me." "I had someone at Vivian's location overnight," Rourke said. "After the team withdrew from the hotel, she made 2 calls. One to a number we haven't traced yet, which is the cartel line. One to a number we have." A pause. "It's Augusto's personal mobile." Serafina breathed in slowly. "Out." "How long was the call?" 4 minutes. 4 minutes was a conversation. 4 minutes was not a check-in or a misdirection. 4 minutes was an exchange of information from a man who had spent 11 years building a reputation as retired, harmless, positioned perfectly outside the conflict. A man who had planted himself in exactly the right place to be the first person a woman rebuilding her family's authority would call. Because of course she would call him, because he was old and trusted and had known her mother and everything about him said safe. Everything about him had been designed to say safe. The summit, Serafina said. Vivienne knows the summit location and she knows the layout. She looked at Constantine. She has it from Augusto. Yes, Constantine said. Which means the summit is a kill box, Birch said. The words hung in the air with the particular weight of something that has been true for a little while before being said out loud. Serafina looked at the two photographs on the table. Her mother's face, young and certain, holding documents that had protected her family's name for generations. The edge of Augusto's profile, caught by accident or by the specific irony of a world where nothing stays hidden long enough. She had 8 days until the summit. She had 11 retired enforcers and a fractured network, and a list of patriarchs who were currently traveling toward a location that had been compromised. She had Cassian on a leash that Marco could hold for 23 more hours. She had Petra on the accounts, and Rourke on the flanks, and Birch sitting across from her with his mother's letter and a face that said he was in this now, all the way, whatever that meant. She had lost Augusto, which meant she had lost everything she'd built on the assumption of Augusto, the cover, the timing, the buffer between her and the open. She stood in the small office at 9:05 in the morning and understood that she was now operating without the architecture she'd spent 10 days constructing, and that every person attending the summit would walk into that hall in 8 days carrying the assumption of safety that she could no longer honestly give them. She also understood something else, something colder and more clarifying than any of the fear or the grief or the vertigo of the last 20 minutes. Augusto had made himself necessary. She had let him. Which meant the first move was not to rebuild what she'd lost. The first move was to become the kind of person who didn't need what he'd provided, which was not actually different from who she'd always been, but was something she had been carefully avoiding being, because being it completely, without mitigation, without the buffer of trusted intermediaries and sealed letters and patient sequences, being it completely meant stepping into the open. She picked up her phone and began making calls. Not the careful, sequenced calls of the last 10 days, but something different, something faster and less protected. The calls of a woman who has decided that the time for working in the dark is over because the dark has been compromised, and the only move left is to step into the light before the people who know where she's standing can use that knowledge. "Birch," she said while the first call connected. He looked at her. "Can you drive?" "Yes." "Good," she said. "We're going to start visiting people in person." The call connected. She turned away from the table and said, into the phone, in a voice that was entirely even and entirely certain and carried nothing that resembled hesitation. "This is Serafina Vale. I need to speak with Don Ferrante directly. Tell him the summit has been compromised, and I have proof. And tell him I'm prepared to show him in person. Today." A silence on the other end. Then the sound of someone moving, quickly, away from wherever they'd been standing. She looked back at the photographs on the table one more time. Her mother's face, young, certain, holding the thing that had always been the point. Then she turned away from the table and walked toward the door, and the door opened into the gray morning, and she stepped through it without breaking her stride, because the time for standing still had ended the moment Augusto picked up the phone and called the wrong person, and whatever came next was going to require her to move faster and more openly, and with considerably less protection than anything she'd planned for, which was not the worst thing, and Birch's footsteps fell into pace behind her, because she had never, in the deepest part of herself, believed that she could do this from the shadows. She had only been hoping she wouldn't have to do it in the light. Don Ferrante received her at 11 in the morning. Not at his home. That would have been too exposed, too easy to surveil, and Ferrante had survived 6 decades in this world by being a man who did not make himself easy to watch. He received her at a tailor shop in the Old Quarter, a place that had been in operation since before either of them was born, and that smelled of wool and cedar and the specific kind of old money that doesn't announce itself. 2 of his men were on the street outside. 3 more were inside, positioned with the casual precision of people who had been doing this long enough that they no longer needed to think about the positioning. Ferrante himself was 78 years old and moved like a man who had made peace with the pace of his own body. Not slow from weakness, but slow from the particular authority of someone who has never once been required to hurry. I was sitting in a leather chair when she came in, and he looked at her for a long moment without speaking, the way he'd looked at her at the gala, the way she suspected he'd looked at her mother before that, which was with the specific attention of a man measuring something he wasn't sure he could afford to underestimate. "Sit," he said. She sat. She put the photographs on the table between them. Then the photocopy of the founding charter. Then a third document, one she'd had from her own records, her mother's handwriting in the margins, annotations that connected names and dates and the specific architecture of authority that the founding compact had established, and that the last 30 years had allowed to erode into assumption. Ferrante looked at each document without touching them. His face did not move much. His hands, resting on the arms of his chair, did not move at all. When he'd looked at everything, he looked back at her. "Augusto," he said. "Yes." "How long?" "I don't know," she said. "Long enough that the architecture was thorough." He positioned himself as the first person I would call, which means he either anticipated this moment years in advance or someone told him it was coming and gave him time to prepare. "Vivian's people," Ferrante said. "Or the cartel behind Vivian's people," Birch said. He was standing near the door, not seated, which Ferrante had noted with a glance when they came in but hadn't questioned. If the cartel had been watching the syndicate long enough to identify Vivian as an entry point, they'd have been watching long enough to identify the other pressure points. Augusto's position, trusted elder, retired, unimpeachable, would have been visible from the outside. Ferrante looked at Birch for a moment. "Your mother worked the archive," he said. Birch went still. "You knew her." "I knew of her," Ferrante said. "There's a difference. She was careful. I respected careful." He looked back at Serafina. "The summit location." "Compromised," she said. "Augusto had the layout from Constantine. He passed it to Vivian within 24 hours. Then we moved the summit." "We can't move the summit without alerting every family that something is wrong," Serafina said. "And if every family knows something is wrong before we've contained the cartel's network, we get 40 different reactions from 40 different people, and the whole thing fractures before we can hold it together." Ferrante was quiet for a moment. "You want to keep the summit at the original location." "I want to let Vivian believe it's going to go the way she planned," Serafina said, "which means the summit stays where it is, which means we know what's coming, and she doesn't know we know, and that gives us the only advantage we're going to get." "She has the layout," Ferrante said. "She knows the entrances, the exits, the sightlines." "She does," Serafina agreed, "which means her people will be positioned accordingly." She looked at him directly. "But we'll know where her people are positioned, because we know what the layout tells you if you're planning to turn a summit into a massacre." Ferrante looked at her for a long time. Something moved in his face that she couldn't fully read. Not approval exactly, but a kind of recognition, the look of a man who has been in this world long enough to know what it takes to be in it, and has just seen that quality clearly in someone he hadn't been fully sure possessed it. "What do you need from me?" he said. "3 things," she said, for the second time in 12 hours. She was aware it was the second time and didn't care. "I need you to contact the other patriarchs privately, not through the usual channels, through your own. Tell them the summit proceeds, but they should travel light. No large security details. Small teams, trusted people only. They'll want to know why. Tell them you're asking them to trust you," she said. "They will." Ferrante inclined his head slightly, which was agreement. "Second," she said, "I need access to the summit hall 12 hours before the event, not official access. Back access, service corridors, loading bays." "I have a relation with the property," Ferrante said. "I know." The faint suggestion of something that might eventually become a smile. "Third." "When it starts," she said, "and it will start, I need you to stay at the table." He looked at her. "Whatever happens in that hall," she said, "whatever you see, stay at the table and let it unfold. Because the moment a patriarch runs, everyone runs, and if everyone runs, then we never get the thing I need to happen in that room to happen." She paused. "Can you do that?" Ferrante was quiet for 5 full seconds. Then, "I am 78 years old," he said. "I have been running from things for 60 years. I think I am prepared to stop." She picked up the documents and stood. "Serafina," Ferrante said. She looked at him. "Your mother was the best of them," he said. I never told her that. I should have. He turned back toward the window. Don't make the same mistake I made. She left the tailor shop and walked back into the cold morning with Birch half a step behind her, and she did not let herself think about what Ferrante had said until she was in the car, and then she thought about it for exactly 30 seconds, and then she put it away. There was too much left to do to carry it now. The next 6 days were the most operationally dense of her life. She moved every day, different locations, different cars, Doris driving, and Constantine riding, and Birch increasingly operating as something she hadn't had before and hadn't known she needed, which was a person young enough to think differently about problems she'd been approaching with older instincts. He tracked the cartel's communication patterns using a method that involved monitoring the metadata of encrypted traffic in ways that should have taken weeks and that he completed in 36 hours, which told her things about his background she hadn't asked about yet and filed for later. She met with 11 patriarchs in 5 days. Not all of them through Ferrante, some through Rourke, some through the quiet network of connections she'd been building for 18 years while everyone around her was watching Cassian. Every meeting was brief. She showed documents, answered questions, let the weight of what she was presenting do most of the work. Because a woman who oversells is a woman who doesn't trust her own material, and patriarchs who have been in this world for 40 years can smell overselling like smoke. 6 of them committed immediately. 3 wanted time. 2 said nothing and showed nothing, and she counted them as uncertain and moved on, because you couldn't build on uncertain. On the 5th day, Rourke called her at 6 in the evening. Enzo Falcone broke, he said. She had been expecting it. To Cassian or to Vivienne? Vivienne directly. Bypassed Cassian entirely. That was interesting. What did he give her? Your movement patterns from the last 4 days, Rourke said. She's been tracking which patriarchs you've met with. She knows you've been building toward the summit. She knew that already. She knows it's working, Rourke said. That's different. A pause. She's scared, Serafina, which brings me back to what I told you 8 days ago. Scared men do things quietly and fast, she said. Scared women too, Rourke said. She stood in the kitchen of the 4th safe location she'd used that week, a house that belonged to no one connected to the syndicate, that Doris had sourced through a contact so peripheral the chain was nearly invisible, and looked at the wall where she'd pinned the summit hall layout. Entrances marked. Camera positions. The 3 locations that the cartel's positioning strategy, as reconstructed from Birch's communication analysis, identified as optimal for the kind of coordinated entry that would turn a gathering into a kill box. She's going to move before the summit, Serafina said. I think so. Not at me, she said. She can't get at me directly, and she knows it now. She'll move at someone I can't afford to lose. The silence on the line had the quality of Rourke agreeing with something he wished he didn't have to agree with. Marco, he said. She had thought the same thing. Marco was the last line of restraint on Cassian. Without Marco, Cassian went fully to Vivienne's direction, and Cassian going fully to Vivienne's direction 3 days before the summit meant the entire operational structure on his side of the house would be mobilized against her. Not just the cartel's external team, but the syndicate's own captains, its own soldiers, people who didn't know they were being used and wouldn't understand what they were walking into. I need to reach Cassian directly, she said. That's not through Marco, directly. She turned away from the wall. Tonight. Rourke was quiet for a moment. He's not at the penthouse. Vivienne moved them both to the estate 3 days ago. More controlled environment, more of her people. Then I go to the estate. Serafina, that is, I know what it is, she said. Set it up. She went alone. Not because she wanted to go alone, and not because she believed being alone was strategically optimal. She went alone because arriving at Cassian's estate with any visible support read as a threat, and a threat would get her shot at the gate by men following orders they didn't understand, and she would be dead in a driveway without having said the thing she needed to say. Doris drove her to the estate road and stopped 300 yards from the gate. 20 minutes, Serafina said. If it's longer than 20 minutes, Doris said, looking at her in the rearview mirror, I'm coming in. You will not come in. I will absolutely come in. Serafina held her gaze in the mirror for a moment. 30 minutes, she said. Then come in. She got out of the car and walked up the road in the dark, in the cold, her hands visible at her sides, because a woman approaching a fortified position with her hands visible was communicating something specific, and she needed to communicate it precisely. The gate guard saw her at 50 yards. She could see the shift in their posture, the tension, the reaching toward weapons, the brief exchange between them that she couldn't hear but could reconstruct. Then the gate opened. Someone had called ahead, which meant someone inside had been watching the road, which meant they'd known she was coming. She filed that and walked through the gate. Cassian met her in the entrance hall. He was wearing a shirt with no tie, and the look of a man who hadn't been sleeping any better than she was, which meant whatever composure he was managing cost him. His eyes went to her hands, a reflex, not an accusation, and then to her face. "You came alone," he said. "Yes." "That was stupid." "It was necessary," she said. "Where is she?" "Upstairs." He glanced toward the ceiling, a gesture that contained about 4 different things. "She doesn't know you're here." "She knows," Serafina said. "She has people watching the road. So does the cartel." She stepped closer to him, keeping her voice below the threshold of anyone listening from a distance. "Cassian, Marco is a target. Tonight or tomorrow, before the summit. Vivian needs him removed because he's the last thing between you and her complete control of your decision-making." Something moved through his face, the specific look of a man being told something he's already been afraid of and has been managing by not naming it. "You can't know that." "I know it the same way I know the cartel has the summit hall layout and 3 insertion points planned for the night of the event," she said, "because I've been doing the thing I've always done, which is pay attention." She held his eyes. "Get Marco out tonight. Tell him you're sending him on an errand. I don't care what errand. I don't care where. Get him physically out of reach." Cassian looked at her for a long moment. His jaw was tight. His hands were at his sides, and one of them, the right one, had closed into a loose fist without him seeming to notice. "And then what?" "Then you come to the summit," she said, "and you stay out of her way. And when it's over, you answer for what you did. Not to her, not to me. To the commission. They'll suspend my authority." "Yes," she said simply. His fist tightened fractionally. "You could have just let it destroy me. You didn't have to come here." "Marco didn't earn whatever she's planning for him," she said. "That's why I came." He looked at her for another moment. This man, this impossible, infuriating, catastrophically proud man. And she watched something in him move through a sequence she couldn't fully follow, arriving somewhere she hadn't been sure he was capable of arriving. "I'll send him to the coast," Cassian said. "Tonight. I'll make it look like a supply issue." He exhaled. "He'll know something's wrong." "He'll know," she agreed. "He's Marco." "Yeah." A pause. "He'll go anyway." She turned toward the door. "Serafina." His voice again, the same way it had been at the cigar lounge. Not commanding, not performing. Just her name, said plainly by a person who didn't have much plain left. "The ring. When the commission votes, don't," she said. "I need to say it." She stopped but didn't turn. "Say it fast." "It was always yours," he said. "I knew that. On some level I knew it from the beginning. I convinced myself that what I'd built was enough to override it." A silence. It wasn't. She walked out. The night air hit her like something physical, and she kept her pace steady down the driveway, hands visible, back straight, the specific gait of a person who has just been inside an enemy position and is now exiting it with whatever she came for. She was 50 yards from the gate when she heard the upstairs window open behind her. She did not look up. She kept walking. The summit morning arrived with flat, pewter-gray sky and the kind of cold that had no ambition to warm up. She was in the summit hall at 6 in the morning, 7 hours before the event's scheduled start. Ferrante's property contact had given them a service entrance code, and she went in with Constantine and 4 of the retired enforcers, moving through the back corridors with the small, insulated flashlights that Constantine preferred to phone lights, because phone lights left metadata. The hall itself was vast, a former concert venue that the syndicate had used for formal gatherings for decades, its high ceilings and marble floors and long rows of seating creating an acoustics problem that paradoxically made it safer for conversations that needed to stay between people, because sound scattered rather than carrying. She'd been in this room 14 times in 18 years. She knew it the way she knew her own hands. She knew where Birch's analysis had identified the three insertion points: the east service corridor that fed into the hall behind the speaker's platform, the loading bay access on the north side that could be breached with standard commercial equipment in under 4 minutes, and the upper gallery, technically sealed, officially unstaffed, that provided sightlines to the entire floor. She put 2 enforcers on the east corridor, one on the loading bay, one in the upper gallery, because one was enough if the one was the right one, and the woman she sent up there, Greta, the orchid grower, the former intelligence coordinator, had put more people out of commission from elevated positions than anyone in that building was going to expect from a 61-year-old woman with reading glasses on a lanyard around her neck. Constantine took the floor. She took the platform. She stood at the center of the speaker's platform alone for a moment in the empty hall with its 7 hours of silence still intact, and looked out at the rows of empty chairs that would be filled in the afternoon with the people who would decide what the next iteration of this world looked like. She thought about her mother, the photograph, the way authority looked when it was held by someone who understood what it was for. She thought about Augusto, which still produced something she didn't have clean language for, a cold, clarifying anger that she understood was not the most useful feeling, but that she was no longer trying to suppress, because suppressing it would cost energy she didn't have. She thought about nothing for 30 seconds, because 30 seconds of nothing was the only thing she had that resembled sleep. Then she stepped off the platform and went back to work. The families arrived between noon and 1:30. She watched them come in from the service corridor, not hiding, but not visible, standing at an angle that let her see the room without being in it. Ferrante came first, as she'd asked, arriving 40 minutes early and sitting at the center of the primary table with the stillness of a man who had agreed to stay in his seat and was honoring that agreement with his whole body. The other patriarchs filed in over the following hour. Some she'd met with in the last 5 days. Some she'd only seen from a distance. Each of them moved with the specific quality of men who had been told to travel light and didn't fully know why, and were managing their uncertainty through the professional discipline of not showing it. Cashin arrived at 12:45. Without Vivian, which told her Marco's removal had held and the departure had cost him something internal, and Vivian was improvising. He sat on the far side of the table, away from the platform, and did not look for her. Vivian arrived at 1:15. She came in through the main entrance with 4 people, not soldiers or not obviously soldiers, dressed in the kind of business-adjacent clothing that said attendees rather than security. But they moved wrong. They moved with the compact, load-bearing quality of people who were carrying things that weren't being displayed, and they positioned themselves at the 3 points of the room that Birch's analysis had identified, which meant the information from Augusto had been accurate and they were using it exactly as she'd anticipated. The dawn ring was on Vivian's hand. She wore it the way she wore everything, as if she'd been born to it, as if the wearing itself was argument enough. She sat at the head of the table as if that had been prearranged. No one challenged it immediately. The hall settled into the specific, pressurized silence of a room full of people who know something is wrong and are waiting to see who names it first. Serafina stepped out of the service corridor and onto the hall floor. She walked to the platform. Her heels on the marble floor made a sound that was simple and clear and carried the full length of the room, and the heads turned to follow it, one by one, until every person in the hall was watching her walk to the center of the platform and stop. She looked at the room. The room looked back. Vivian's face had gone entirely still. The stillness of a person watching something they planned for arrive in a configuration they didn't plan for. Serafina said, "Before this summit is called to order, there is a matter that requires the room's full attention." Nobody spoke. 3 of the individuals currently in this hall entered through access points that were provided by a source who has been communicating with an external cartel organization with the specific intention of using this gathering as a mechanism for violence. She said it the way you say things that need to be said without decoration. I have documentation of those communications. I have physical evidence of those access points being compromised, and I have people at each of those positions right now. The 3 men Vivian had brought in visibly shifted. They looked at each other, then at Vivian. Vivian stood up. The dawn ring caught the light. Sit down, Vivian, Ferrante said. The voice of a 78-year-old man, quiet and completely without heat, carrying across the marble with the particular quality of words that have never needed volume to produce weight. Vivian did not sit down. The cartel you've been working with, Serafina said, has been under surveillance for 6 months by 3 of the families in this room. Not because of this situation, because of a separate matter that converged. She looked at Vivian directly. When they pull those records in the next 48 hours, your name is going to be in them. Something crossed Vivian's face, the first crack in the performance, a fissure that started at the eyes and moved to the mouth and produced something raw and trapped and dangerous. You think you can walk in here with paper and... I think the families in this room are adults, Serafina said. I think they can read. She reached into her jacket and produced the documents. Not copies, the originals, because the originals mattered, because 32-year-old paper with her mother's handwriting in the margins was a different argument than any reproduction. She set them on the platform edge where they were visible to the table. Ferrante stood, slowly, with the deliberateness of a man performing an intentional act. He reached up and removed his hat. And then he bent his knee. The sound that produced in the room was the sound of everything that had been suspended since the Centennial Gala finally coming down. One by one. Not fast. Nothing in this moment was fast, because this was not a thing that should be rushed, because a thing done quickly in this room would be read as pressure, and pressure was not what was being communicated, deliberately. One patriarch, then another, then the men beside them, then the bodyguards and the underbosses and the men who had come in carrying weapons, they hadn't been asked to surrender. The marble floor filled. Vivian's hand went to her jacket. Cassian moved first. He was across the table before she cleared the weapon, his shoulder taking the impact of her arm and driving her aim wide. And the shot that came from the weapon hit the ceiling and produced a sound like the room cracking open. And then there were voices, all of them at once. And the 3 cartel positions in the room activated simultaneously because that was the protocol when the primary action failed. Activate immediately, create chaos, extract what could be extracted. The East Service corridor erupted first. 2 of the retired enforcers came through from behind the cartel's position at that entry point. They had been there for 7 hours, completely silent, completely still, in the dark behind a storage rack that looked solid and wasn't. And the engagement that followed was brief and ugly and ended before the cartel's second man had cleared his weapon. The north loading bay lasted slightly longer. Greta, in the upper gallery, was not asked to wait. She did not wait. The gallery gave her sightlines to the entire floor, and she used 3 of those sightlines in the space of 90 seconds with the calm, unhurried accuracy of someone who had once been very good at a very specific thing and had retained the relevant skills through whatever the orchid-growing years had and hadn't changed about her. In the center of the hall, the bowed heads had gone flat to the floor at the first shot, a reflex that lived in the bodies of men who had survived long enough to have reflexes, and Serafina had dropped from the platform to the floor, not because she was afraid but because the floor was the right position, the position that kept her visible to the people she needed to be visible to while keeping her out of the angles that mattered. She pressed her back against the platform base. The firing from the North Bay was intermittent now, slowing. The cartel's east position was silent. Cassian had Vivian on the floor, his weight across her arms, the weapon somewhere she couldn't reach, and he was breathing hard and bleeding from a cut above his eyebrow where something had caught him during the impact. And he was looking down at her with an expression she couldn't see from her angle, but that she would have recognized if she could. The expression of a man who has been used in a way that a part of him had known all along and had chosen not to know, staring at the evidence of it from 2 feet away. "It's over," he said to her. His voice was ragged and entirely certain. "It's done." "Done." Vivian said something back to him that Serafina couldn't hear from the platform base. Cassian's expression, from what she could read in his posture, did not change. The hall went quiet by degrees, but the way storms go quiet, not all at once but in layers, the loudest things first and then the smaller sounds underneath. Serafina waited until the silence had texture, the specific texture of something having ended rather than paused. And then she stood up. Constantine was at her left. Birch was at her right, appearing from somewhere she hadn't seen him move from, with a cut on his forearm that he was ignoring with the focused indifference of someone who had decided it wasn't relevant yet. The people who had been on the floor began to rise. Ferrante was the first patriarch to stand, again, as he had been the first to kneel. He looked at her from across the marble, and his face held an expression she'd seen on very few people in her life, which was the expression of someone who has been waiting for something for a very long time and has just watched it arrive. She looked at the room. The room was battered and breathing hard and still carrying the specific electric quality of people who have been through something they cannot yet fully process, who are in the moment between the thing happening and the understanding of what the thing means. She looked at Vivian, now restrained, the dawn ring still on her hand, her composure finally, completely gone, replaced by something ugly and real and utterly human, the look of a person who has calculated everything and discovered that the calculation was wrong at its foundation. She looked at Cassian, who was standing now, one hand pressed to the cut above his eye, looking back at her with the expression she'd been trying to read for 18 years and could now finally read clearly, which was simply, "I know." And she looked at the documents, still on the platform edge, undamaged, her mother's handwriting visible from where she stood. The original charter, the original mandate, the thing that had always been the point. Everything that had been set in motion 10 days ago on a rainy morning when she'd sat in a small apartment and read Rourke's 4 words and pressed her palms flat against her thighs had arrived here, in this hall, in this particular broken and breathing and still standing moment. She had one thing left to do. She stepped back up onto the platform, and the room went quiet. The way rooms go quiet when something that has been suspended for a very long time is finally, irrevocably about to land. And she looked at the assembled faces, battered and wary and waiting, and opened her mouth to speak. She said, "My name is Serafina Vale." She said it the way you say something that has always been true, but has never before been said in the right room at the right moment with the right weight behind it. Not loud, not performing loudness, just the name, in the silence, landing on marble and high ceilings, and the faces of men who had just been through something and were not yet sure what came next. My mother was Lucia Ferrara Vale. Her mother was Constantina Ferrara. The Ferrara line is named in the founding charter as one of 4 bloodlines, whose collective consent created the authority this commission has operated under for 100 years. She paused. Not for effect, to breathe, because she was human, and she had been running on insufficient sleep and insufficient food for 10 days, and her hands, flat at her sides, were not entirely steady. That charter did not expire. It was not superseded. It was misplaced, deliberately and otherwise, by people who found it more convenient to operate without it. Nobody spoke. The hall held its breath. The dawn ring was created as an acknowledgement of that mandate, not as a replacement for it. The ring carries the authority of the bloodline that holds it. Without that bloodline, it is jewelry. She looked at Vivian. It was never hers to wear. Vivian, restrained now by 2 of the enforcers, said nothing. Her face had closed into something that was not composure. Composure was a choice, and this was the absence of choices, which looked similar from a distance and was entirely different up close. The dawn ring was still on her finger. Someone would need to address that, and it would need to be done specifically and without ambiguity. Serafina stepped off the platform. She walked across the hall floor to where Vivian stood, and the room watched her walk in the same way it had watched her walk out of the Centennial Gala, with the particular attention of people who understand they are watching something that will not be repeated. She stopped in front of Vivian. Up close, Vivian was, Serafina had to be honest with herself about this, not what she'd expected. She had built a picture of Vivian over 2 years from surveillance and documentation and the things Cassian had revealed, and that picture had been of a specific kind of threat. Calculated, cold-blooded, a woman who had identified a target and pursued it with the patience of someone who did not experience doubt. What she saw in front of her now was something more complicated. The calculation was real. The pursuit had been real. But underneath it, visible now that the performance had stripped away, was something rawer and more recognizable. A person who had wanted a thing badly enough to do whatever was required to get it, and who had not fully understood until this moment what the cost of that would look like from the inside. Serafina understood that feeling. She did not forgive it. She did not dismiss it. She reached out and took Vivian's hand, not roughly, but with the specific deliberateness of a woman completing an act, and removed the dawn ring from her finger. Vivian let her. What remained was not surrender exactly. It was more like the quality of someone who has finally stopped holding something up and is feeling, for the first time, the full weight of what the holding had cost. Serafina stepped back. She held the ring in her palm for a moment. old gold, heavy, the founding crest catching the light in a way that seemed disproportionate to its size, as if it had been waiting for a long time to be held by the right hand. She turned back to the room. Ferrante was watching her. He gave one slow, small nod. She placed the ring on her own finger. The next 4 hours were administrative in the way that the aftermath of large, violent things tends to be administrative, unglamorous, exhausting, requiring the kind of precise attention that the body resists when it is running on adrenaline residue, and the specific hollowness of aftermath. The cartel's 3 men in the hall were alive, all of them, because alive was more useful than the alternative. Alive meant the communication logs on their devices and the chains of contact they represented could be extracted and used. And Birch spent the better part of 90 minutes with those devices in the hall's small service office, cross-referencing what he found against the network map he'd been building for 6 days. What he found was more than expected, and once it was laid out, clarified certain things that had been opaque. The cartel, Vivian's cartel, the organization she'd been cultivated by and had in turn cultivated a relationship with over 4 years, had not been primarily interested in the Romano Syndicate's operations. They had been interested in the Commission's financial architecture, the legitimate fronts, the account structures Petra had been watching, the decades-long web of shell entities and holding companies that transformed the syndicate's earnings into assets that existed in the real economy. If the Commission recognized Vivian as its authority, every one of those entities became accessible to the cartel, not through force, not through violence, but through the legitimate mechanisms of the financial structures themselves. It was, Birch told her quietly, standing in the service office with a cut on his arm he had still not addressed, the most sophisticated thing he'd seen anyone attempt in the 5 years he'd been inside the organization. It would have worked, he said, not admiringly, factually. If I hadn't walked out of the gala, she said. He looked at her. Is that how you see it? That your walking out stopped it? My walking out started the clock, she said. If I'd stayed, if I'd absorbed the humiliation and remained in my position, she would have had no reason to accelerate. She would have had time to build what she needed, and I would have had no reason to dismantle it, because I wouldn't have known what it was. Birch was quiet for a moment. Cassian humiliating you in public was the only thing that gave you the space to move. Yes. Does he know that? She thought about it. He doesn't need to know it, she said. It changes nothing about what he did. She left the service office and went back to the main hall. The Commission's formal session convened at 3:30 in the afternoon, which was 2.5 hours later than the scheduled start and under conditions that nobody who would write the official record would describe accurately, because the official record would be a version that the men in the room could live with, and the version they could live with did not include what the ceiling looked like from the shot that had gone wide or the way the marble had looked near the east corridor. But the session happened. That was what mattered. Serafina sat at the head of the table for the first time in her life. Not because she had arranged it or because it had been pre-negotiated, because when the patriarchs settled into their positions and the shape of the gathering organized itself around the logic of what had just happened, the head of the table was simply where she was, and no one suggested otherwise. Ferrante opened the session because he was the eldest, and because he had been the first to kneel, and in the logic of this world, those two facts together gave him the right to speak first. The matter before this commission, he said, is the question of authority, not operational authority, constitutional authority. The question of whose name gives this body's decisions the legitimacy that makes them binding rather than merely powerful. He looked at the room. We have operated for 30 years as if that question was settled. It was not settled. It was deferred. Today, it is settled. He looked at Serafina. The floor is yours. She addressed the commission for 40 minutes. She laid out the founding charter and its implications, the account of the bloodline mandate, the specific ways in which the ring's history connected to the Ferrara name, and the documentation that confirmed it. She answered questions, 6 of them, from 6 different patriarchs, some skeptical and some procedural, and one, from a very old man named Bianchi who had barely spoken during the entire day, that was so precise and historically specific that it told her he'd known some of this for years and had been waiting for someone to say it aloud. At the end of the questions, Ferrante called for the vote. It was not unanimous. 2 of the patriarchs, the 2 who had given her nothing when she'd met with them in the last 5 days, abstained rather than voting against, which was its own kind of answer and which she accepted, because two abstentions in a room that had held its breath through what this room had held its breath through was not opposition. It was caution, and she understood caution. The rest voted in favor. When the vote was recorded, Ferrante looked at her and said simply, "The Commission recognizes Serafina Vale as the holder of the founding mandate." She nodded once. Then she said, "I want to address the Cashin-Draven matter before we close this session." The room shifted slightly. The specific micro-adjustment of a group of people who have been expecting something and are now in the moment of receiving it. Cassian was at the far end of the table. He had a cloth pressed to the cut above his eyebrow, and he had been sitting with the particular stillness of a man who has made peace with something difficult and is now in the experience of living with that peace, which is harder than reaching it. He met her eyes when she said his name. His expression was not afraid. It was not defiant. It was the expression of a man who is present for whatever is about to happen and has decided not to perform anything about it. Cashin-Draven acted tonight in a way that prevented the escalation of violence in this hall, she said. That is noted, and it is real. She paused. It does not undo the Centennial Gala. It does not restore what his actions damaged. The alliance structures that held this commission together were built over decades on the legitimacy of my family's name, and he treated that name as a personal asset to be disposed of when it suited him. Another pause. The Commission should consider whether a man who held authority under those conditions should continue to hold any portion of it. The room was very quiet. Cassian set down the cloth. The cut had slowed, but not stopped. He looked at the table for a moment, then at her. "I surrender the authority willingly," he said. "I'm not contesting it." He looked around the room once. "I owe most of you an apology that I'm not capable of making adequately right now. What I can tell you is that the decision I made at the gala was mine alone. I will carry it alone." Nobody spoke. Then Cassian pushed back his chair, stood, and walked out of the hall without asking permission or saying anything further, and the sound of his footsteps crossing the marble was the same simple, clear sound as hers had been, arriving, which struck her as the kind of symmetry that means nothing and that you notice anyway. What? Vivienne was held in a secure location, one of the syndicate's assets, a building that had served this function before, and that had the specific, purposeful bleakness of spaces designed not for comfort, but for containment, while the Commission determined what her disposition would be. Serafina went to see her the next morning. She went alone because what she needed to do there required no witnesses, and because the decision she'd made about it in the early hours of the morning, lying on a cot in the Summit Hall's back office because there had been no useful point in going elsewhere, was a decision she'd made entirely by herself and intended to deliver entirely by herself. Vivienne was sitting at a small table when Serafina came in. She had been given clothes, food, water. She looked not broken, because the word broken implied something that had been whole in a way Serafina was no longer sure Vivienne had been. She looked like someone who had run a very long distance and had stopped and was now sitting with the feeling of having stopped. She looked up when Serafina entered. Her eyes went immediately to the dawn ring. Serafina sat across from her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. "You're going to exile me," Vivienne said. Not a question. "Yes." "Not—" She stopped. Something moved across her face. "I expected worse." "I know you did," Serafina said. "The Commission discussed worse." She looked at Vivienne directly. "I argued against it." Vivienne was quiet for a moment. Her eyes were working, trying to understand the logic, trying to find the strategic reason, because strategy was the language she had always spoken, and she was reaching for it now because it was what she had. "Why?" "Because what you did was monstrous, and you did it for reasons I understand," Serafina said. "Because killing you would make you a martyr to the people who funded your operation, and I will not give them that narrative. And because—" She paused. "I'm going to build something different from what existed before. And what I build needs to be recognized as different from what existed before. Which means how I handle the person who tried to destroy it matters." Vivienne looked at her for a long time. The strategic processing in her eyes gradually slowed and was replaced by something Serafina hadn't seen there before, something that might have been, in a different life, under different conditions, the thing that precedes honesty. "I thought it was just power," Vivian said. The ring, the name. I thought it was symbols that men agreed to believe in, and if you got enough of them to believe in you instead, it would transfer. A pause. I didn't understand what the name actually was. No, Serafina agreed. You didn't. Do you? Vivian asked. Fully? It was a strange question to ask in this room, from this position, and it was the most genuine thing Vivian had said to her. Serafina considered it honestly. I think I'm learning what it is in real time, she said. I don't think my mother fully understood it either. I think that's the nature of it. It's not a thing you possess. It's a thing you're responsible for. Vivian looked at the ring one more time. Then she looked at the table. Where do I go? Somewhere far, Serafina said. The commission will give you the specifics. You will not return to this country. You will not contact anyone connected to this organization. You will not attempt to reach the cartel operatives. The ones who are still free are already burning their own networks, and you are no longer useful to them. And if I do any of those things? Serafina looked at her without warmth and without cruelty. Then I will stop arguing against worse. She stood. She was at the door when Vivian said, behind her, the man at the gala, when he put the ring on my finger. She stopped. Did he love me? Actually? Serafina stood at the door for a moment. That's not a question I can answer for him, she said. You should have asked him while you had the chance. She walked out. Augusto was the last. She had been thinking about him since the morning after the summit, in the specific way you think about something that isn't finished, circling it, approaching it from different angles, looking for the version of it you can live with, and finding that the version you can live with keeps revealing new edges. He was at his property when she arrived. She had expected that, had expected him not to run, because men like Augusto didn't run, and because the property itself, the tomatoes, the dogs, the kitchen that smelled of things she couldn't name, had always been the best version of his cover. He fit there. The fitting was part of it. He was sitting in the garden when she came through the gate. One of Constantine's people was at the fence behind her. One was at the house. Augusto looked at them and then at her, and his expression was the expression of someone who had known this was coming and had decided what to do with that knowledge, which was to sit in his garden and wait for it. She sat across from him at the garden table. The tomato plants were behind him, and the single red fruit she'd seen weeks ago on her first visit had been joined by 3 more, small and aggressively present, against the green. She looked at him for a long moment. He looked back. How long? She said. 12 years, he said. The honesty of it hit her differently than she'd expected. She'd been braced for deflection, for the kind of layered justification that people in long positions produce when they're finally asked to explain. Not this. Not the flat, immediate acknowledgement that bypassed pretense entirely. They came to me 12 years ago, he said. Not Vivian. The people behind her. The cartel that was eventually behind her. They had acquired certain information about my financial situation. Debts that were not public. Decisions I had made that were not wise, and that if they became known, would have removed me from this world in ways that were not comfortable. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. The same gesture she'd always read as thoughtful, and now read differently. They asked for information. I gave them information. Over time they asked for more, and I gave them more because the alternative got more costly with each year. You told me about the window closing, she said. You pushed me to move. Yes. Because they wanted me to move. They wanted you to expose yourself before you were ready, he said. They believed that if you moved too fast, before the documents were fully in the right hands, before the patriarchs were fully aligned, you would overextend and fail. And a failed attempt would have given Vivian the justification to consolidate what she needed. She absorbed this. But I didn't fail. No. He looked at his hands. You were ready before I told you you were. You had been ready for some time. A pause. I underestimated that. They underestimated that. You underestimated me, she said. Not with heat, just the fact. Your mother's daughter, he said very quietly. And this time those words landed differently than they had on the phone weeks ago. Not as a compliment with warmth in it, but as a recognition that had cost him something to make. She looked at the tomato plants for a moment. The morning light was on them. It was a clear day, cold but clear, the kind of morning that makes everything look more defined than it usually does. What you did, she said, gave them the hotel location. It gave them the summit layout. She looked back at him. Marco could have died. He said nothing. People could have died in that hall because of information you gave them, she said. Nobody did. That's not because of you. No, he said. It isn't. The commission once you tried, she said. He nodded slowly. Not surprised. Not fighting it. I told them to wait, she said. He looked at her then. The first time in the conversation that he'd looked at her with something other than the contained, directed quality of a man delivering a prepared account. Something older and less organized moved across his face. Why? Because you are 83 years old and you will not survive a formal proceeding, she said. Because the cartel will spend whatever they have to spend to make you a public casualty the moment you become a formal witness, which will kill the case before it builds. And because... She stopped, looked at the tomatoes again. Because you knew my mother. I don't know what that means yet, but it means something. He was quiet for a long time. What happens to me? He said. You stay on this property, she said. Your communication goes through a monitor that Constantine controls. You give Birch everything you have on the cartel's network. Names, contacts, timelines, account trails, everything. You cooperate completely, and you do not withhold and you do not manage what you give us. She paused. In exchange, you are not tried. You live on this property. You grow your tomatoes. Something crossed his face, complex and slow and not cleanly readable. The expression of a very old man being offered a version of the rest of his life that is both less than he deserved and more than he'd feared. That's generous, he said. It's strategic, she said. Don't call it generous. She stood. He didn't try to stop her. She was at the garden gate when she paused, not turning, looking at the gate's old ironwork. Weathered, solid, built to last longer than the people who installed it. The photograph, she said. The one with you and my mother. Were you her friend? A silence from the garden. For a time, he said. Yes. She opened the gate and walked through it. The weeks that followed were not triumphant, because nothing in real life that has cost as much as this had cost arrives wrapped in triumph. They were dense and complicated and full of the kind of work that doesn't produce visible results immediately. The re-examination of every financial structure that Petra had flagged. The identification and notification of the patriarchs whose operations had been tangentially exposed by the cartel's access. The quiet and methodical dismantling of every communication channel that Augusto had provided over 12 years. Birch worked 18-hour days for 3 weeks and did not complain once, which told her something about him that she filed and did not yet say out loud because there was a time for saying things, and it wasn't while people were working. Rourke took a formal position within the Commission's advisory structure, which he accepted with the expression of a man receiving an honor he found faintly absurd and intended to take seriously anyway. My mother would have had something to say about this, he told her, at the brief, functionally informal acknowledgement that served as a ceremony because nobody had the energy for more. What would she have said? Serafina asked. Something Irish and profane and ultimately approving, he said. She was like that. Petra restructured the account architecture over 6 weeks, working with 3 other financial people she'd trained over the years. And when she was done, she walked Serafina through the entire new structure in a 2-hour session that ended with Petra saying, "It's cleaner now, not because I made it cleaner, because the thing that made it dirty is gone." Serafina looked at the diagrams on Petra's table. How much did they have access to? Enough, Petra said. Not everything, but enough that if the summit had gone their way, she stopped. It would have been quiet. That's the thing about what they were doing. It would have been quiet and gradual, and by the time anyone noticed, the moving parts would have been too integrated to extract. But they didn't get it. They didn't get it, Petra confirmed. She began rolling up the diagrams. For the record, what you did in the last 6 weeks was the most operationally complex thing I have seen in 40 years in this world. I want that noted somewhere. I'll note it, Serafina said. I'm serious. I know you are. Serafina looked at her. It's noted. She saw Cassian once. It was accidental, or as accidental as anything in this world ever was, which was to say, it might have been accidental, and it might have been that they both chose a restaurant in a part of the city that was neither of their natural territories and arrived at the same hour for reasons that neither of them examined too carefully. He was with no one. She was with no one. They sat at separate tables across the restaurant from each other, and this fact was acknowledged by a shared look when she came in. A look that contained 18 years in it and was over in 3 seconds. He looked thinner. Not ill, just reduced, the way people get reduced when the structure they've inhabited for decades is no longer around them. He was drinking coffee. He was reading something on his phone. He looked like a man learning to occupy less space than he was used to, which was not a small thing to learn. She ordered. She ate. She did not go to his table, and he did not come to hers. When she was leaving, she passed within 10 feet of where he sat, and she felt, rather than saw, him look up. She did not stop. She did not turn. At the door, she paused for one moment. Not for him, not for the history, but for herself. For the specific act of acknowledging that something had been there and was now finished, and that the finishing of it was both a loss and a relief, and that holding both those things at the same time without resolving them into one was what honesty cost. Then she walked out into the street. The commission's first formal session under her authority was held on a Thursday morning in late winter. She chose a different location than the Summit Hall deliberately, because the Summit Hall would carry what it carried for some years yet, and formal occasions didn't need to be burdened with the weight of specific rooms before they'd established their own weight. The new location was smaller, less dramatic, a long room with good light and a table that seated 20 and chairs that were functional without being ceremonial, because she had decided early that if the commission was going to become something different, it needed to stop performing what it had been and start doing what it was becoming. Ferrante was present, the only person from the original founding generation who remained in active participation. He sat at her right, which he had suggested and which she had accepted because it meant something to have him there, not as a symbol exactly, but as a continuity, the living acknowledgement that this was not a rupture, but a renewal. Birch was at the table. She had asked for him formally, which had produced a silence from the other patriarchs that she had waited out without commentary. And after the silence, they had agreed, because this was the first direct test of what her authority meant in practice, and everyone in the room understood it as such, and had made the right decision. Rourke was present. Petra was present as an advisor, which was not a traditional role and which she had created because she needed it, and because the Commission's inability to adapt was precisely one of the things that had made it vulnerable to what Vivian had attempted. Greta was not present. Greta had returned to her orchids and had been explicit about not wanting formal recognition, which Serafina respected and which she intended to honor, though the orchids had received a delivery of excellent soil amendment the following week from a supplier with no return address. The session ran 4 hours. It was practical, detailed, and contentious in the specific productive way that things become contentious when the people in the room are genuinely trying to solve problems rather than performing the solving of them. She made 2 decisions that nobody challenged, and 3 that were challenged hard, and 1 that she reversed after the challenge because the challenge was better than her position. At the end, when the session was officially closed and people were gathering themselves to leave, Ferrante remained seated. He waited until the room had emptied, except for the 2 of them, and then he looked at her with the expression she'd seen in the tailor shop, the one that was not quite approval and not quite relief, and lived in the space between them. "Your mother," he said, "would not recognize the room. She would recognize you." She looked at him for a moment. "You keep saying things about my mother at the end of things," she said. "I have a lot to make up to her," he said simply. "You're the only one left to make it up to." She stood and began gathering her papers. "Then keep coming to the sessions," she said. "That's how you make it up." He laughed. A short, real sound, old and unadorned. "That's the price?" "That's the price." He nodded and stood slowly and gathered his coat from the back of his chair. At the door he paused and looked back at her, and she was already reading something, already moving to the next thing, which he looked at for a moment before turning and walking out. On the last evening of February, she stood alone in the Commission's new hall after everyone had left. The room was quiet in the specific way that rooms are quiet when they have just been full of voices and activity, and the voices have gone, not empty, but settled, carrying the residue of what had been in it. She stood at the window. The city was doing its usual thing outside, traffic, light, the specific energy of a place that does not stop, that does not pause to acknowledge the things that happen within it, that simply continues. She looked at the dawn ring on her hand. Old gold. Heavy. The founding crest engraved on its face, worn slightly at the edges from 100 years of being passed between people who had understood what it was, and people who hadn't, and people who had understood pieces of it and lost hold of the rest. She thought about the Centennial Gala and the moment Cassian had slid it onto another woman's finger. She thought about removing her wedding band and setting it on a table like it was nothing, which it had been, and which it had also been the beginning of everything that followed. She thought about Augusto in his garden, old and reduced and still there, giving Birch information in twice-weekly sessions that were producing the most comprehensive cartel network map that had been assembled in 15 years. She thought about the hotel room with the open door and the coffee cup with the lipstick mark and the index card with the name on it. She thought about her mother in the photograph, young, certain, holding the document, standing with a woman whose daughter would 30 years later hand Serafina the photograph in an old farm storage building at 5 in the morning. The thing about this world, she had understood for a long time, was that it did not change easily and it did not change quickly. And most attempts to change it failed because the people attempting it were trying to replace what existed rather than transform it. Replacement produced resistance. Transformation required patience and precision and the willingness to hold the tension of a thing being one thing and becoming another simultaneously without forcing the resolution before it was ready. She was not naive about what she had inherited. She was not naive about the distance between where the commission was and where she intended it to be, or the number of people who would resist that distance, or the specific category of thing that tended to happen to people who tried to close it. She was also not naive about herself, about what she was capable of and what the last 2 months had revealed about the shape of what she was capable of. Not comfortable things, some of them. Not easy things. The index card with a name on it. The decision about Augusto. The decision about Vivian. The moment on the platform when she'd placed the ring on her own finger and felt, underneath the weight of the moment, not triumph, but something quieter and more permanent. The feeling of a person who has arrived somewhere they have been walking toward for a very long time and is now required for the first time to stop walking and begin the harder work of staying. She turned away from the window. She picked up her papers, her coat, the small bag that held the documents, the originals, which she kept on her person, which would be secured properly by the end of the week, but which she wasn't ready to relinquish to a file or a safe quite yet, because there were things you carry with your body for a while before you trust them to a structure. She crossed the empty room. At the door she paused, hand on the frame, and looked back at the long table with its 20 chairs in the winter light. The room as it was, before it became whatever it was going to become. This particular still moment between one thing and the next. Then she turned off the light and walked out, and the door closed behind her with the quiet, definitive sound of something that has been waiting a long time to close. And the hall was dark, and the dawn ring was where it had always belonged. And outside the city continued in its endless, indifferent, necessary motion, carrying forward everything that had happened and everything that was about to happen, the way cities do, the way the world does, without ceremony, without pause, without waiting to be told it was allowed to go on.